When a toxic family member passes away, the grief is often mixed with a complicated sense of relief. But for one woman named Sophia, the death of her estranged mother was only the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare. Sophia's mother was a cold, strict, and deeply unpleasant woman. But the real reason Sophia had cut all ties with her was far more sinister. In the years leading up to her death, her mother had become deeply involved with a bizarre, dark cult. She began performing disturbing occult rituals inside her house, bringing a heavy, oppressive, and dark energy into the home. Black shadows were frequently seen darting across the walls at night, and the terrifying atmosphere finally forced Sophia to pack up her family and leave. Years later, on a freezing, dark February afternoon, Sophia received a call from her sister. Their mother had been found dead on her living room sofa. The coroner ruled it a sudden heart attack. Sophia reluctantly drove to the funeral home to fill out the necessary paperwork. Her sister had to leave early to care for her newborn, leaving Sophia completely alone in the quiet, depressing reception area. As she was filling out the forms in the dead silence, a voice suddenly echoed from the dark hallway behind her. "Sophia, I'm here." Sophia froze. It was the distinct, unmistakable voice of her dead mother. Terrified but driven by a morbid need to confirm that her mother was truly dead, Sophia stood up and slowly walked down the long, narrow, dimly lit hallway. The voice echoed again, pulling her toward the very last door at the end of the hall, a door marked "Employees Only." The room was pitch black. Sophia pushed the door open and turned on her phone's flashlight. Lying naked on a cold steel table in the center of the room was her mother's lifeless body. But her dead eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Overwhelmed, Sophia turned away for just a second to look for a light switch. In that split second, the heavy squeak of the metal table echoed through the dark room. Sophia frantically shined her flashlight back at the table. Her dead mother was no longer lying down. She was sitting straight up, her head turned, staring directly at Sophia with a cold, expressionless face. Sophia backed out of the room in absolute terror and sprinted down the hallway, crying hysterically. She lied to the receptionist, claiming she just felt sick from grief, and rushed home, too traumatized to tell her husband what she had seen. The next morning was the official wake. Sophia brought her husband and 2 children. The casket was placed in a large viewing room. There were no windows, and the room was illuminated entirely by tall candles and a few overhead lights. While Sophia and her husband were paying the funeral director, she noticed her 6-year-old daughter, Daniela, was missing from the lobby. Sophia rushed into the viewing room and stopped dead in her tracks. Little Daniela was standing right next to the open casket, leaning over the edge, happily talking and giggling to the empty air inside. "Danny, what are you doing?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Daniela looked up and smiled. "Grandma doesn't want me to leave. We're talking." Sophia's blood ran cold. She looked into the casket. Her mother's eyes were tightly shut. Sophia violently grabbed her daughter's arm and dragged her away. Daniela began screaming and fighting back, crying that her grandmother was begging her to stay. Sophia's husband rushed in, scooped the crying child up, and took her outside to the convenience store to calm her down. Left alone in the viewing room, Sophia fell to her knees and began praying furiously, begging God to let her mother's soul find peace and to leave her family alone. Suddenly, without a single draft of air in the windowless room, every single candle around the casket was violently blown out at the exact same time. A second later, the overhead lights completely died. The room was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. A wave of freezing terror washed over Sophia. She scrambled to her feet and ran for the heavy wooden doors, but they were jammed completely shut. She pounded on the wood, screaming for help, but the funeral home was empty. Then, in the pitch black, a freezing, stiff hand firmly grabbed Sophia's shoulder. She slowly turned her head in the dark. A raspy, demonic voice whispered directly into her ear. It was the voice of her mother. "I'm coming back for her. The child is mine. I promised her to the devil." Sophia collapsed to the floor, completely blacking out from sheer terror. She woke up hours later in a hospital bed, surrounded by her husband and sister. They explained that they had found her unconscious in the viewing room and rushed her to the ER. Panicking, Sophia ripped her IVs out and screamed, "Where is Daniela?" Her husband said he had left the kids back at the funeral home with her brother-in-law. Ignoring the doctors, Sophia ran to the parking lot, forced her family into the truck, and sped back to the funeral home like a maniac. She burst through the front doors, screaming her daughter's name. Her teenage son said Daniela had just gone into the restroom. Sophia kicked the restroom door open. It was completely empty. Absolute panic erupted. Everyone began frantically searching the building. But Sophia had a sickening realization. She slowly walked back into the dark viewing room and approached the casket. Her mother's corpse was gone. The casket was completely empty. Sophia didn't wait. She sprinted down the long dark hallway toward the employees-only room, where she had seen the body the day before. She kicked the door open. The room was pitch black. In the corner, she could hear little Daniela crying softly. "Danny, walk towards my voice," Sophia pleaded. "I can't," Daniela sobbed. "Grandma will get mad." "Where is she?" Sophia asked, her voice shaking. "She's right behind you." Sophia spun around and shined her phone's flashlight. Standing right there in the dark, physically blocking the doorway, was the naked, rotting corpse of her mother, and she was smiling a massive, terrifying, evil grin. Sophia screamed, dropped her phone, and blindly grabbed her daughter in the dark. She shrieked for help until the funeral director finally ran down the hall and flipped the lights on. The room was empty. The corpse was gone. Sophia grabbed her family and fled the building forever, refusing to return. Later that night, Sophia's sister called in hysterics. The funeral directors had finally found their mother's missing corpse. It had reappeared inside the closed casket in the viewing room, but it was completely and totally incinerated. The body was nothing but a charred, unrecognizable pile of ash and bone, as if it had been burned alive from the inside out. The police investigated, but could never find a logical explanation. But Sophia knows the terrifying truth. Whatever was animating that corpse wasn't her mother. It was a demonic entity trying to collect the soul of her daughter. And when it failed, it dragged her mother's body straight down to hell. Working as a receptionist at a funeral home is a depressing, quiet job, mostly consisting of answering phones and directing grieving families. But for a young college student desperate for tuition money, it quickly became a paranormal nightmare. One evening, a small funeral was about to begin in the main viewing room. The lobby was mostly empty. Suddenly, a very elegant older gentleman wearing a sharp, vintage suit walked through the front doors. He looked incredibly disoriented and confused. The receptionist politely asked if she could help him find his family. The man looked around blankly and asked, "What is this place?" She explained it was the San Carlos funeral home. The man shook his head, muttering that he must have made a mistake, and quietly walked away down the hall. The receptionist assumed he was just a confused elderly man who had wandered in from the street and went back to answering her phones. A few hours passed. The sun went down and the funeral home grew dark and quiet. As the receptionist got up to grab a coffee, she glanced through the large glass window that looked into viewing room B. Sitting completely alone in the dark room, staring blankly at the empty casket pedestal, was the exact same elegant elderly man in the suit. This was impossible. Viewing room B was completely empty that day, and the heavy wooden doors were strictly deadbolted from the outside when not in use. She walked over to the door and tried the handle. It was locked tight. She knocked on the glass, telling the man he couldn't be in there. He didn't even flinch. He just kept staring blankly straight ahead into the dark. Spooked, she ran to get the overnight security guard. She told him someone had broken into the locked room. The guard was confused, stating that he was the only one in the building with the master keys. When they returned to the viewing room and unlocked the door, the room was completely empty. There was no other exit. The man was gone. The guard locked the door again, assuming the stressed college student was just seeing things. Her shift was finally ending. Before leaving, she had to do a final head count in viewing room A, where the actual funeral service had just concluded. She walked into the room. The grieving family had already left, leaving only the closed casket and the large memorial photograph displayed on an easel next to it. The receptionist looked at the photograph, and her heart completely stopped. The man in the memorial photo, the man inside the closed casket, was the exact same elegant, confused elderly man in the vintage suit who had spoken to her in the lobby just hours before. She burst into tears and ran out to the parking lot. A senior employee saw her crying and stopped her. When she hysterically explained what she saw, expecting him to call her crazy, the older man just sighed sympathetically. He told her she wasn't crazy. He had seen the exact same things over his years of working there. He explained that sometimes souls who die suddenly are incredibly confused. They don't realize they are dead, and they wander the halls of the funeral home, trapped in a temporary limbo before finally crossing over. The receptionist forced herself to work there for 3 more months to pay for school. She constantly saw dark shadows moving in the empty building, but she eventually learned to just look the other way. Jorge works as an embalmer in a busy city morgue. His job is incredibly gruesome. He spends his nights alone in a freezing, sterile basement, draining bodily fluids, sewing severed limbs back together, and reconstructing crushed faces so families can have an open casket funeral. It takes an incredibly strong psychological toll, but Jorge had grown numb to the horror. Recently, the morgue assigned a young medical student to be Jorge's late-night assistant. One night, they were working on the body of an elderly man who had died peacefully of a heart attack. Suddenly, the transport elevator dinged. The morgue attendants wheeled in a new body bag. It was a young motorcyclist who had been brutally killed in a high-speed collision. His body was completely mangled. Jorge told the attendants to place the young man's body in the upstairs holding room while they finished embalming the elderly man downstairs. Around 2 a.m., the morgue was completely empty except for Jorge and his young assistant. They were working in total silence. Suddenly, the heavy, distinct sound of work boots pacing back and forth echoed directly from the ceiling above them. The footsteps were coming from the upstairs holding room, the exact room where they had just placed the dead motorcyclist. The young medical student froze, his face turning pale. Jorge tried to calm him down, stating it was probably just the pipes settling. But 2 minutes later, the heavy footsteps started again. This time, they weren't in the room above them. They were slowly, methodically walking down the metal staircase leading directly into the basement. Jorge grabbed a heavy wrench. The building was strictly locked down at night. He told the student to stay put while he went to check the stairs. He crept up the metal steps and flipped on the upstairs lights. The holding room was completely empty. The dead motorcyclist was exactly where they had left him, securely zipped inside the heavy black body bag. Confused, Jorge began walking back down the stairs to the basement. Halfway down the steps, he stopped. Sitting perfectly upright in the middle of a metal step was a small, dirty teddy bear. It hadn't been there when Jorge walked up. There were absolutely no children in the morgue, and the basement was a highly restricted biohazard zone. Feeling a deep sense of dread, Jorge picked the bear up, set it on a side table, and hurried back to the embalming room. He told the terrified student that it was nothing, and they needed to hurry up and start working on the motorcyclist. Jorge sent the young student into the adjacent supply closet to grab some specific reconstruction tools. While Jorge was waiting alone in the sterile room, the heavy metal door to the supply closet violently slammed shut, followed by the terrified, blood-curdling screams of his young assistant echoing from the other side.